Thank you to you all for attending, for organizing this. It's, in my opinion, the most important form of outreach that I could do is direct civic engagement. So forums like this are essential in developing those relationships, especially for someone who is completely new to the political scene here. My name is Valentina Mendoza. I go by Vale. I am a trans, Chicana, neurodivergent working class attorney. I focus on economic empowerment in my practice. My training and background happens to be in corporate law and commercial transactions, data privacy. But I've over the years come to a very deep and personal understanding of the issues that come with traditional business savvy approaches to the practice of law, and that informs my lived experience and how I approach reform in this space and how I approach this campaign in many ways. I'm somebody who is running on a platform completely built on their lived experience, and not from the sense that I'm somebody who can speak to moments of privilege that make me someone that should stand out in these rooms, more so someone who has lived the consequences of the policies that are imposed on on the communities that I represent by individuals who can't relate because they don't have that lived experience. By way of example, I'm someone who has survived addiction, various forms of physical and different types of abuse, financial instability. I grew up and lived on public assistance. I've gone through bankruptcies, and I've had to navigate institutional gatekeeping in everything that I've done professionally, and even in the healthcare and the various different moments that I've needed support from organizations that are built to enable progress. So I can speak not only as someone who has lived those consequences, but as someone who has faced them and also surpassed them and built a successful career from it. I'm a former Wall Street attorney. I currently work in-house for a public benefit corporation. They're certified B Corp. I work in the regulatory and innovation space. And like I said, I also have a side practice where I have a pay what you can model for innovative businesses that are focused on social impact. The bulk of my platform is designed to run against lawmakers who never face the consequences of their decisions. That means economic empowerment. That means social justice reform in such a way that it really pushes the conversation as far progressive as we can get it. Because I think what we have in districts like District 7 is a lot of candidates will focus on what they feel is feasible, and that waters down the message before you even get into the arena where the discourse should be had.
Thank you very much. Well, then I'll take the privilege of asking you the first question, and I realize some of your response will have been covered by your introductory remarks. But my question is, what in your background and experience would make you suited to represent New Jersey 7 in Congress? And why would you be a better choice than the seven other Democratic candidates?
I, I'll speak for myself with respect to the others. There are some beautifully qualified individuals with respect to what their background is concerned. Intertwined in that, however, is a lot of establishment connections with respect to party machinery or prior government experience. There's a lot of involvement in mechanisms that have been incredibly problematic for the communities that I represent. And when I speak to that, I speak to the intersectional nature of my existence, not necessarily specific to myself as a trans individual. But I will speak quite frequently about that issue because it is such a beautiful expression of various forms of oppression in such an extreme form. But I digress. I'm not an establishment candidate by any measures. I don't have accountability to party machinery. I don't have accountability to public donors, to private donors or corporate donors in any way. And I really am looking to reform aspects that are biased because of that input and reliance on that machinery. A big example of that is corporate accountability. I've seen that rot from the inside, having worked in-house at major corporations. The last large corporation that I worked for was right here in New Jersey, laid off a large group of people with no notice. And I saw what goes into that retrospectively, and it was something that I couldn't stomach any longer because we enable those machines to continue to work in the ways that they are intended to and impact communities like mine disparately because we do not have safety nets to rely on beyond what our current circumstances are. So the fallout of the criminalization of addiction, wage stagnation, healthcare gaps, the housing crisis, crippling student debt, they're all manifestations of broken safety nets that impact Black, Brown communities, immigrant communities, neurodivergent disabilities, people with disabilities disparately. That's what my platform will be. That's what makes me different. I bring the professional acumen as someone who has, in their very early years, published an article that scholars in constitutional law have cited on presidential succession. That was done during law school. I worked under the architect of the 25th Amendment in that way. I bring the sophisticated legal practice, I bring the knowledge, but I also live those consequences. And that is something that most candidates in this race cannot speak to personally.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valley. I'll turn to Dan Murphy. Dan, would you like to ask our next question?
Good to meet you. Um, this is a more tactical question, I guess. If you became the Democratic nominee, what would be your plan for winning in the 7th district, which has more Republican voters than Democrats registered, and where the past two candidates, one of them an incumbent, were not able to prevail? And the second part of it, and you touched on party machinery and so forth, what sources of campaign funds do you expect to be able to tap? And would you seek endorsements from the county Democrat organizations in the primary scramble, or would you try to work around them?
So I'll address the first section, the first part of that question, which is what would I do to sort of speak to voters and win the race in the general? I think a common misconception is that this area, because of some of its affluence, um, a candidate would necessarily have to run on a more moderate platform. I think that's a mistake. I think we are excluding large portions of the population here, and I speak from personal experience, that do not see themselves in the current Democratic establishment. We see it across the board with candidates like the governor's race, where individuals that I was speaking to, the people that I was trying to excite about my race, didn't know who Mikey Sherrill was and couldn't care about her platform because it just didn't take them into account. Was it an important victory? Was it necessary? Sure, but it felt like more of the same. So that approach, in my opinion, cuts out a very common thread between blue and red individuals in the working class, which is centered around affordability, centered around economic mobility, stability, safety nets. They're all the things everybody was frustrated about, but we speak about them in different ways because slogans like draining the swamp have that appeal because you're living those same consequences of corruption. So my focus would be to focus on communities that are typically overlooked. I'm speaking to people with addiction issues. I'm speaking with people with criminal histories. I'm speaking to immigrant communities, people that have relatives that have immigrants in their families that are afraid at the moment of the essential Gestapo force that ICE has turned into and the concentration camps that are currently on US soil. That's my focus because that is what people don't see coming from the Democratic establishment. That's what I believe will engage younger voters. That's what I believe will engage progressives that are sick of centrist candidates. So when it comes to what I will be doing as far as funding is concerned, my priority is to preserve my autonomy and authenticity. That means I'm not chasing those endorsements. And frankly, I tried the first few months of my campaign to reach out to either establish the establishment, the parties, the local parties, the various committee members. They either don't respond or the response I get is that my issues are best left to ride on the coattails of others. So, as far as I'm concerned, my support will come directly from the communities that I seek to make meaningful impact in. And the biggest thing I can give them is that authenticity and uncompromised allegiance to their security.
Thank you, Valley. So I'm going to turn to Anne for our next question. Anne is in Atlanta today, and we had some connection issues. I hope we can hear you now, Anne.
Oh
And yeah,
no.
and we can't. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. So Anne, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question, okay? Okay. Anne's question is, what would be your top priorities as a member of Congress how could you effectively pursue them as a first-term representative, and what committees would you seek to serve on and why?
A central aspect of what I'm looking to do is focus on an overarching issue in this country, which is a over-reliance on corporate extractive economic systems. We rely, for example, a huge topic right now is affordability and healthcare. Both those issues are symptoms of corporate systems in this country that we are overly reliant on for our existence. Wage stagnation is an issue, and that addresses corporate accountability. It also pricing. There are far too many large conglomerates that are extracting profits and resources from communities, from local economies, because they are not based in those economies and they displace small businesses. So I'm looking to create a platform and to create policy that would enable individuals to find work and to also be able to afford different resources that they need. An example of that and a manifestation why I call it economic justice is I think it's time that we start discussing reparations. I think what makes it very unpalatable is that it seems like handouts, and it doesn't have to take that form. What I think is there is a debt there that should be paid to communities that have been impacted by discrimination over the years in this country. What we can do is offer funding, seed funding for micro businesses that address needs in small communities that have been impacted by gentrification or by large corporations that are killing small businesses. So you don't necessarily need to be the most innovative company. You don't need the next AI platform that will revolutionize knowledge workers in XYZ way. You can set up a bakery. You can set up a local restaurant, whatever it is you want to do in your local community. But that will then in turn create places for people to buy affordable products, to be able to pay wages, and to keep that money within the community as opposed to continuously funding boardrooms and executives that will not reinvest in those local communities. That would be a top priority of mine. I think it's been completely overlooked in the past. I'd also focus on human rights expansion and codifying various rights that are sort of relied on through case law. The right to privacy has been heavily relied on to expand protections for individuals like myself. Also, bodily autonomy, we see what was done in the sense that the rights are sort of rolled back by corrupt individuals in different jurisdictions or courts that sort of use government loopholes to jump ahead of what the policy initiative might have been by interpreting clauses in ways that are sort of push us back. If you enshrine those statutorily in the Constitution, again, by an expanded Bill of Rights, I think by then you are able to protect individuals in a way that enshrines those rights so that there cannot be a question of interpretation that then rolls back someone's access to abortion, for example. I'm also anti the industrial prison complex. I don't think prison labor is a viable source of labor for large corporations. You can pay them pennies on the dollar, and you have a captive community of typically minorities that are doing this work. We also need comprehensive immigration reform. Let's acknowledge the fact that immigrants in this country account for a large portion of our labor force, and we rely on them for essential functions, food being one of them, and agriculture being a huge component. It's time we create uh, pathways to citizenship that also provide dignity throughout that process and acknowledge the fact that their labor is essential to our functioning. So it really is the thread of addressing the disparate impact that our policies have by overlooking and sanitizing these policies beyond recognition, such that they're palatable issues because you're not addressing problematic aspects of them. But we need to have those discussions and really revisit the minutia of that. And it's difficult to run on that platform because it's complicated. But I think the American people are far more sophisticated, especially in this district. And we owe them that to really get into the weeds of these policies.
Thank you, Vale. And I just realized I skipped Joan Peters. Joan, can you step in and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Joan,
Hi,
and nice
Joan.
to meet you. Um, this question, you have covered some of it, so I think focus on the wealthy. How would you present yourself to voters across the district, from its urban areas to its wealthy suburbs to the rural towns? What policies and messages do you believe could bring those disparate communities together to support your candidacy?
So my platform really is being built around governing from the margin. And I can see how that might feel exclusionary to some that don't see themselves in those ways. But the reason I think that that is so important is because the issues that people on the margins face are demonstrative and sort of extreme manifestations of what others experience. An example I'll give is let's take transgender individuals, for example. Our access to healthcare is so complicated. You essentially need to be an attorney to be able to successfully navigate that system. And even then, forces at play with respect to cost will sort of impose various different barriers to either delay your access, such that you no longer have the insurance because you lost the job, the company went bankrupt, whatever it may be, that it takes so long to do anything that you end up having to jump through those hurdles time and time again, and all you're doing is delaying your access. The reason I bring that up is because anybody can relate to that. Anyone with some sort of chronic health condition, even day-to-day stuff. You speak to people with diabetes, you speak to people with sickle cell anemia. It impacts them in the same way. You're navigating the same appeals process, the same convoluted plans, the same medical networks dictating coverage levels. And that's a manifestation of corporate sort of greed and input into these systems where they really should have no place. And a huge issue that I see is most people don't realize that in a lot of ways for large corporations, your employer dictates the level of coverage that you receive through ERISA plans. They're exempt from local plan requirements. Departments of insurance within each state should have the right to regulate care levels. Your doctor should be able to prescribe something and you receive that. That is circumvented by your employer because they dictate what your plan is since they're self-insured in a lot of ways. So we need to remove them from from the equation. We need to remove insurance doctors from the equation and dictating what care level should be. That relationship between a doctor and a patient, that direct connection needs to be respected as much as we respect attorney-client privilege, to the point where it is something so sacred that monetary implications cannot come into play when you're navigating somebody's care needs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Valley. And Joan, I know that you have
You know,
other engagements and that you have to jump off. So
Oh,
thank
so
you very
lovely to
much for
see you.
joining us. Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
Right then, I'll pass it over to Linda. Linda, I got a feeling that this question is going to be something that Valley is going to jump all over, but of course.
Good morning, Valley. You talked about the issue of immigration. As an individual member of Congress, what could or would you do to protect those New Jersey immigrants who've never been convicted of a crime from being arrested, detained, imprisoned, or deported without due process?
Oh, yeah, you're right. I totally will jump all over this. So, as someone whose parents came to this country without documentation, it is incredibly important to me that we start recognizing the dignity that is needed to be injected into those processes. The reality is that our Constitution does provide basic protections for anybody in this country. Everybody is entitled to due process, everybody is entitled to be heard. Those rights are not being respected. Congress's oversight rights are not being respected, and we need to start holding people accountable for those violations. So I immediately upon entering, I would propose to abolish ICE and remove funding entirely. I don't think it's necessary in any way, shape, or form to have a separate policing force for that type of community. There is Customs and Border Patrol that can be leveraged. There are avenues that have existed long before that organization was implemented. It is inhumane, and we need to start respecting people's rights and establishing more concrete paths to citizenship and residency that acknowledge the fact that these individuals, for the most part, are not criminals, are not dangerous in any way. They're my father and my mother, one who was a nanny, the other who was a waiter and continues to work and has never been in any situation that would compromise that. So, in essence, I think we skirt around immigration in a way that acknowledges sort of knowledge workers by providing HB1 visas or whatever you may say, and you can bring that sort of desirable individual into the country. But the other individuals who are day laborers can either get bussed in, or if you live in a border town, or are treated like criminals in many ways because we don't allow them access to various resources that they should be entitled to. I would never feel an issue or at conflict because anybody is fed. And we've got this sort of trope that is cast on immigrants as if they're reliant on welfare systems. The only welfare queens in this country are corporations. They receive more support and funding from the federal government than any individual. And I think it's time that we start treating people with dignity and the humanity that they deserve, irrespective of national residency status, because they're part of our communities. They live here. You interact with them day to day. You just don't appreciate the fact that that's what they're going through.
Thank you, Vale. So I'll turn to Susan Pepper for our next question.
Good morning.
Huh?
So this is a little more specific. What could or would you do to help those who stand to lose Medicaid, SNAP, and other benefits due to Republican budget cuts?
So it's an interesting question because oftentimes I think candidates feel pigeonholed into addressing something like this because it sounds so expensive to provide resources to individuals. The reality is we pay for it in other ways. There's various hardships that come about, the impact on the criminal justice system. People typically perform crimes out of necessity and are seeking some sort of economic gain. If you address those needs, if you provide the safety nets that the wealthy would have because of their affluence, you allow people to play with their purpose in life and seek to be useful or innovation, whatever it is they might be, they're able to play. Those safety nets come in the form of public benefits. I think it's incredibly important that we start moving towards normalizing that access to healthcare should be an entitlement. Similarly, access to food should be an entitlement. If you need SNAP benefits, if you need Medicaid, you should be entitled to it irrespective of your economic position. It's better for society at whole. We can't keep relying on emergency rooms for basic care when someone has something they perceive to be an emergency that was entirely preventative. It's far more expensive. So, needless to say, I've implied I would completely support Medicaid for all. I would expand SNAP and increase funding so that anybody can receive it much faster than it takes for you to get into it now. As someone who's been on Medicaid, it takes a very long time to get enrolled. And it takes an even longer time if you have any situation that sort of fluctuates in between eligibility requirements, adding volunteer requirements, adding looking for work. You're sick. If you need health care, why are we adding to that in a moment where you need support? Similarly, if you have a job, you get sick, what do you lose? Your health care. There should be a safety net that government provides. I think it's far more economically feasible to focus on prevention by providing Medicaid for all, but I can hear how that might seem expensive. I think we could do without a few less military experiment operations to fly 4B-2 bombers across the ocean and have them come right back, spending millions of dollars. I think we could do without sending the giant frigate over to Venezuela right now. We don't need to be funding genocides. That's a source of money that we can put towards social impact here in the country.
Thank you, Vale. I think Alice Galembo is up next. Alice? You're on mute. Yep. Okay.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Okay. If you were elected and the Democratic Party took control of Congress, what actions would you favor to reverse Trump's policies? Would they include impeaching and removing Trump and other administrative officials?
They absolutely could. I don't rule it out. I think what we've seen specifically with respect to the Epstein files, which happens to be on everybody's mind at the moment, for good reason, is an obstruction of justice within members of Congress in approaching even an investigation and releasing documents to the full extent that the American people should be entitled to receive. I absolutely would support an investigation, which is what impeachment is. And if that results in any sort of violation that is actionable, then he should absolutely be removed. He himself should be entitled to due process like anybody else. But the reality is that there are issues there that go so far beyond just inklings of questions that they merit real scrutiny. And with respect to the policies that have been put in place, some of them are direct attacks on communities that need imminent support, mine included in various different ways. The fact that I am a Chicana and have parents that have immigration statuses that could be rescinded. They're both US citizens at this point and naturalized, but the fact that we're having conversations on reversing naturalization is disgusting. So, reversing any sort of policies that rescind rights that others have been granted over the years and have become reliant on, I think is paramount. That also includes addressing tariffs, which, by the way, are taxes that people will have to pay. And to address the affordability crisis and to improve international relations, we need to start addressing those trade relationships again. Those tariffs have really hindered our perception economically around the globe. So it's another thing that I would absolutely seek to sort of push reform on. As a member of the House, I have less sway in international policy, but nonetheless, I'd be vocal about these issues and work in the ways that I can to sort of push for this.
Thank you, Vale. And I think that speaks to our last question, which will be addressed to you by Kathy Brower.
Yes, with respect to international policies, would you push for improving U.S. relations with NATO, the the EU, and other allies, despite the Trump administration's disdain for those alliances?
Absolutely. NATO is an organization that we've got long-standing relationships with that should be honored. There are commitments that have been made there to support and protect. And as the largest military on the globe, we have a responsibility to honor those commitments. Those agreements were made in large part relying on those issues. But I think more importantly, we need to focus on expanding the aid that we provide. We need to restore US aid to what it was and expand its funding so that we are providing infusions of capital to communities that have been negatively impacted by US policy. An example I'll give is we speak towards progressive platforms in other nations in very pejorative ways. And it is partially because of the economic system that we hold so fervently in this country. I find that to be a symptom of corporate influence in party politics. We can't keep looking at nations that we fear are progressive models in a vacuum beyond the sanctions that we've imposed on those countries. Do I think there are issues with some of these nations? Absolutely. But the example I'll give is Cuba. We've completely decimated that nation because of the embargoes that we placed on them and the sanctions that we placed over time. This was done out of fear of communism. I'm not saying that that is the type of economic system that I think makes the most sense, but we can't ignore that some of the economic impact that has had in those countries is a direct link to the embargoes that were placed on that nation and how it decimated the country. Our influence goes beyond just our allies. We have a finger in every single platform on an international scale. We have influence over markets, and I think it's time we start taking a more responsible view as a global collective to honor the differences, both in policy, but in people's realities and lived experiences. And the perception of what our policies can be that we are that oppressive nation that we see and brand in others. So I think there's more nuance there that is owed some respect and some acknowledgement beyond just lip service about it being authoritarian because they have progressive models. The reality is we rely quite heavily on branding in this country for our policy. We need to start getting into the nuance of what these things actually mean.
Great, thank you, Vale. That was great. So those are our prepared questions for today. I'd like to give you the opportunity to make a few closing comments if you would like.
Sure. I want to make sure that people understand that the platform that I'm bringing comes with a lot of frustration, and it can feel as if there's a lot of anger there. And there is in many ways, but that is reflected in the communities that I come from. It's reflected in the voters that I speak with. The fact is that the large portion of the population, specifically in CD7, does not see themselves in either party. And I think it's time that we acknowledge them instead of continuously running towards the center just to hedge because there's a certain type of person that continuously votes and continuously shows up. I want to start speaking to communities that don't feel like their voice is heard or taken into account. And I think it's important to express that there's a lot of enthusiasm there and a lot of excitement about the prospect of somebody who can actually speak to those issues. And not only that, have skin in the game when policy is made that might impact their communities. Because I think the most important thing that we forget is that quite frequently people will default to self-interest when it comes to what they pursue. I'm not somebody who has ever approached a political career specifically because I have a very comfortable life. I'm not rich in any way. I'm working class, but I don't chase money. I don't chase opportunity. And quite frequently, politicians are looked at people who are chasing this for either glory, opportunity, whatever it may be. My only goal is to protect my community and to come in and make sure that we set up systems that enable people to succeed. To do that, I think it's time we start discussing term limits. I think it's time we start discussing the need for diverse opinions in those communities so that we finally see versions of politicians that do not reflect sanitized, prescribed policy positions that are calculated to hit a certain mark. That means some of it gets into nitty-gritty details that feel uncomfortable, but I promise there's a lot of joy and excitement because one thing I'll tell you, the funnest community I've ever been a part of is the LGBT, specifically the trans community. I mean, you go to a drag show and that is pure joy. And nobody shines like queer people despite the adversities that they face. And I think that's such a beautiful model for what is possible when we embrace those communities fully.
Great. Thank you, Vale. Well, I'll just say that we really appreciate your time, and a functioning democracy only functions when people are prepared to stand up and run for office and engage in the kind of robust debates that you are championing today. So, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for stepping forward as a candidate. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you,
Uh,
thank all of you so much for giving me the platform.
And thank you all to our questioners for getting up on a Sunday morning and taking the opportunity to speak with Valet. So thank you all very much. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Have a
Thank
nice Sunday.
you.